What's up, team? Coming at you guys with another episode of Anabolic Radio. It's your host, Coach Hawk, with HawkFit Coaching and Legion Athletics. And today I'm joined by Dr. Pack. Don't forget the doctor in there. He's a professor and is a coach at Stronger by Science. He has worked with some of the individuals that you've probably been familiar with on this podcast, such as Dr. Eric Helms, Dr. Bill Campbell. He has a few papers with Dr. Campbell, Dr. Steele, Guillermo Escalante, quite the resume. And most importantly, he's someone that not only works in the lab, but also coaches some of the top level powerlifters in the world, in addition to having a massive passion for resistance training and exercise science. And today's episode will be based around being a great practitioner, which not only understands having a practical first world experience on how to coach, but also someone who knows their strengths, limitations, and is up to date with some of the evidence-based coaching practices that the literature concludes. So without further ado, Dr. Pack, why don't you go ahead and give the audience a little bit of an intro and background on yourself?
Thank you so much for having me on, and I appreciate the very wholesome intro. I'd like to say that, yeah, the doctor is always there because we are the real doctors. Medical doctors are mere physicians that, from my opinion, don't know what they're doing, and they're just wildly guessing and feeding people stuff and see if that works. But joking aside, as you said, I am both an academic and a practitioner. I do research as part of the Applied Muscle Development Lab at Lehman College over in New York, while I'm also affiliated with some people in the UK. As a practitioner, I am a coach for StrongerByScience.com. I do work with competitive powerlifters, physique athletes, as well as recreationally active individuals. At the moment, there's nobody that would fit the characterization of some of the best in the world, but pretty high level competitors, right? Because the best in the world would be like elite level, Sheffield level competitors. However, I have worked with national and international competitors, including national champions and record holders in the IPF. But I do love all things lifting. I'm somebody who lifts himself. I have powerlifted in the past, but my lifting is mostly recreational. And I am a big proponent of evidence-based practice, something that I do think gets misrepresented, and we end up with caricatures of evidence-based practice, as well as in the trenches, real-world practice and that experience. And that often results in a schism, for lack of a better term, where you end up with two different battlefields, when in reality, those battlefields don't necessarily accurately represent what it truly means to be evidence-based or be somebody who values practice.
So given the current landscape of the current social media age that we're living in, and information being readily available at our fingertips, what are some of the prerequisites you'd say that are important for coaches to consider when it comes to being a great coach, and more than that, in some cases, an evidence-based communicator? Because it's not sometimes just about reading the abstract. Sometimes it's about looking at the questions that the researchers are investigating, and also the methods of the studies and limitations of those.
Yeah. So I think that evidence-based has become a bit of a buzzword and a bit cringe. The term evidence-based, right? Not actually being evidence-based. So it is often associated, obviously, this is just an observation, right? So there's no citation that I can provide for this, but my own observation is that it's almost buzzword-like to a certain degree, and you see people claiming to be evidence-based when in reality they have a surface level scientific understanding. They sometimes treat science as an absolute answer, and they like the sexy aspect of science. So hey, here's a graph from a study, or here's a bar chart, or here's a sentence that says X percent of people do this and that leads to the other. So without obviously accounting for the boring stuff and the arguably more important stuff like nuance, limitations, a holistic view of the literature, which obviously requires one to actively be engaging in science and reading scientific papers. Something that many people, including PhD holders and self-proclaimed evidence-based educators, don't necessarily do because they're busy and they can't do it. But now that so evidence-based becoming a bit of a buzzword has an overall negative effect on the scene and practitioners too, because I do think that it leads to people becoming oppositional and developing a distrust in science, because they do see, like I posted a meme today about trained by JP, who's like a very well-known bodybuilder and educator, and has his own company, a very successful businessman, extremely strong, extremely muscular, works with really high-level bodybuilders. But he said that science has nothing to offer for hypertrophy training because it's all in untrained individuals, or like it's not in people that train hard, and it's all done by like pencil neck scientists. But I think because evidence-based as a word and science-based has become a bit pretentious and a bit of a cringe buzzword, that leads to people like him and his followers becoming oppositional and developing a distrust in science, which then leads them to ignoring all scientific data, and saying things like, yeah, that doesn't apply to me, bro, or it's simple, we know it, or whatever. And in reality, being evidence-based is not about just looking at the science, treating science as an absolute answer, and not valuing experience, but rather it's a combination of using science as the base. So, like, for example, science shows us that, hey, more sets in some cases, and more doesn't mean all sets in the world, but more sets may lead to more muscle growth, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you should do 30 sets per muscle group per week and that you can't see growth from 6 or 8. But like if you compare 1 to 4 sets per muscle group per week, 6 to 8 or 6 to 10 maybe will probably be better for muscle growth. But being evidence-based means using the science as the base, and then using your experience, and in certain cases, especially in like niche sports like bodybuilding or powerlifting, and in areas of research where the scientific evidence is limited, experience and preference also play an important role. And there are cases where experience may be slightly more important than the scientific evidence, because there may just not be enough scientific evidence. For example, peaking for a bodybuilding competition. Sure, there are some studies that have explored stuff on it, but you wouldn't necessarily go, okay, let me read the study and base my peak off of what these people said, when I've seen that in practice XYZ works better, and the coach that I've been working with also has made certain observations, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think that people like to push back against something. They like to be against something. In one extreme side on one side of the spectrum, you have the quote unquote evidence-based individuals who push against the meatheads, but then don't treat science appropriately. And then on the other hand, you have the meatheads pushing against the pencil neck scientists. But the truth is somewhere in the middle. And like myself, people like Milo Wolf, or people like the ones you named, are also like Eric Helms. These are lifters. These are people that train very hard, that love being in the trenches, but at the same time want to understand, hey, how does this work? Or is there a better way to go about muscle growth? And if we didn't have science, we wouldn't be able to know. For example, and sorry for the monologue, but like things like training at long muscle lengths, and doing partials at long muscle lengths. That's an example of where science says, hey, guys, we may be onto something here. Sure, there's more space to, there's more research that is needed, but to have like a definitive answer. But if we didn't have science, we would be playing a game of trying to differentiate between signal and noise, when that is somewhat impossible given all the co-founders that exist when one is trying to make observations about what works and what doesn't with himself or his clients. Monologue done.
Great points. And just to add on that, where do you think this dogma sort of stems from, right? Because you'll have different camps of people. Let's say, for example, one camp says you should be training to failure, and another camp says you need to be training far away from failure, 4 reps in the tank. So I think this is something that I experienced firsthand my last contest prep was I kind of structured one of my peaks based on what the current literature is suggesting to be an evidence-based practice for maximizing glycogen stores, so on and so forth. And the end result of the peak was not my best look. And I think where people get lost is not viewing the science as simple guidelines in which they could modify based on their individual circumstances. They just see it as a hard set definitive answer and they need to be doing it like this, otherwise they're not going to get results.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I brought the volume example in. Like, yeah, on average, we see that more volume leads to more growth, but then it's the fault of the quote unquote evidence based crowd that then leads to that dogma IMO, because and because of the age of social media and the need for content and the need for clickbait and the need for very like for a sexy answer to everything, that leads to people running crazy titles or clickbaity titles or making content expressed without the appropriate level of caution, and nobody likes caution. Nobody wants to hear, hey, take this with a grain of salt. People want to be told, yeah, 10 to 20 sets is what you need to be doing, when in reality, yeah, on average we're seeing that more volume will probably lead to more growth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you personally need to be in that exact range to see maximum growth. It could very well be that you need to be in the 8 to 12 set range, sorry, not rep range. But I think that both extremes of the spectrum are what's causing the dogma, and that's what we, in my opinion, truly evidence-based practitioners are trying to change to a certain extent. And people like Eric Helms do an incredibly good job of that, because he is somebody who remains critical, still makes it easy for people to understand the science, because that's another thing, right? But at the same time, he doesn't hit you with a clickbait title that says, high volume trumps lower volume, because that causes a knee-jerk response in some people, and because it's not necessarily true. So they're like, that's not true because I'm a high-level bodybuilder and I've been doing 6 to 10 sets per muscle group per week, and I am an FBB pro or a natural pro or whatever. F them and F everything they put out because of that one thing that somebody said. You get me?
Yeah. It's interesting to see how information gets communicated and played out. And someone I'm sure who you're familiar with, Menno Henselman, sometimes he puts up the titles for these infographics, and I'm like, well, if I read the paper and I look at the findings, sometimes it's a little bit uh, convoluted is the right word, or it's a little bit blown out of proportion,
Exactly, man. And that was a great example, and shout out and respect to Menno. But an example of a post he made recently about the Deloads study that came out from the lab in New York. So the title of the post was Deload weeks as in plural, Deload weeks impair gains, new study finds. And okay, I get the need for a somewhat clickbaity title, but some people, they don't necessarily take it with a grain of salt and factor in that, okay, he's trying to create a hook and lure you in, and because then he does explain the nuance in the description. But some people read the title, and then they're like, oh man, here we go again with a science-based folk new study, because it's literally one study, and it showed that, hey, if you take a deload week, so essentially people took a deload week after 4 weeks of training and then trained for another 4 weeks, and then another group just trained nonstop for 8 weeks, and the group that took the deload week saw some strength decreases in isometric and dynamic strength. And like, that's so much different, and obviously it's one study that is not meant to be taken as the absolute answer for deloads. It should be interpreted as, okay, if you take a week off, your hypertrophy gains are probably not going to be affected. Let's look at the rest of the literature. Training succession studies on powerlifters show that like 3 and 5 days don't seem to affect strength much. Should you really be worried about a week off training? Not really. Should you be taking a deload week when you don't need a deload week? Because participants in that study didn't need a deload week. And it should just be interpreted as, okay, this is the first intervention study on deloads. Um, just a grain on top of just the first sort of pebble that will lead to more studies being made. And deloads are something where we can look at our experience a bit more and what we've been doing as coaches and athletes. But that sort of title makes people go, yeah, you saw the news about the new study. People are saying that deloads are useless, and then that creates this
Confirmation bias.
yeah, and it creates a discussion based on a claim that was never really made by the researchers. Because if you read the paper has limitations, terms and conditions, and it's just one study. No actually evidence-based individual said, "Oh, let me look at this study. All right, yeah, my practice now is no more deloads." You know, like as a coach, as a full-time coach, I didn't like. I was like, "Oh, that's great." Taking a week off from training won't have negative effects on hypertrophy outcomes. Good to know. And okay, this further supports my notion for my preference for reactive deloads. And that was it. Like I didn't think, oh, okay, I guess now I'm not going to be doing deloads whatsoever because they impair gains. You feel me?
Mm. And just to take it a bit further, because we're talking about this recent deload paper. I believe the author on it was Zach from Data Driven by Strength. Nope. Who's the lead author on
Yeah,
it?
it was Max Coleman. Shout out to Max Coleman. It was his master's thesis. So Coleman et al. On Instagram, huge shout out. And it was a really well-run study. Like I'm biased to say it, but I saw some people like, and I have some comments here. Like a guy said, stupidly ran study. 9 weeks is too short to know the long-term benefits of implementing deloads in your training. And it's like, bro, this was a study with 50 people, 38 ended up making it in the analysis because some dropped out. It was very well controlled. It was all supervised training. Well, at least the lower body training that the participants were performing. There were multiple different measures for it was body composition measurements, hypertrophy, strength, and so on and so forth. And because I was present at the lab, there were multiple individuals supervising participants and pushing them to train hard. So it's like, anyways, I'm digressing. I digress. It was a great study, and shout out to Max for leading it because and it was the first study on deloads, man. There's no other study that directly looked at deloads, so that should also tell people something.
Outside of the methods and protocols, I also think people forget how incredibly difficult it is to get participants for a study, and at that, even trained individuals to let you like take over their training and run whatever you want, you know. So I think that's really important to consider. And given that this is the first um, study based around deloads, I do think in the near future this will birth other studies, whether it be on reactive deloads or proactive deloads or a longer training duration before opting for a deload. And as a coach or practitioner, seeing that, um, I never completely thought of writing off deloads. It's just like depending on the person and depending on the context, it could be a tool that's beneficial to dissipate some of that residual training stress that's been accumulated over the course of a training block. So I think that's interesting, and I'm excited to see the results of future studies. And since we're talking about studies and science, I would love to hear about and I'm sure the audience would too, about your PhD and the minimum effective dose. And we could kind of build off of that based on if your goal is more strength in nature or hypertrophy based in nature.
Yeah, for sure. So my PhD was on what's the least a powerlifter can do and still get stronger. And as a result of that, I had to look at the rest of the literature as well. Because before the studies of my PhD, there were no minimum dose like studies on powerlifters. So what we essentially found is that for trained individuals who want to increase their one repetition maximum strength, 1 to 3 sets performed a couple of times, two to three times per week, as low as one set performed 2 to 3 times per week, with like a load corresponding to roughly 70 to 85% of 1RM for sets of 6 to 12 reps, very close to failure. That seems to be enough to lead to significant 1RM strength gains. But then, because we ran studies on powerlifters and I also did interviews, and I'm a big fan of qualitative research in our field, especially in our subfields of strength and physique sports. So we did studies where we took powerlifters and we had them follow different low volume protocols, but also spoke to like some of the best lifters in the world, including like all-time world record holders and coaches who have coached multiple like IPF world champions and so on and so forth. And what we found was that for a power lifter who wants to make meaningful strength gains, they can do so by performing 3 to 6 working sets of around 1 to 5 reps per week, with those sets spread across like 1 to 3 sessions, and using loads above 80% 1RM, like at an RPE of roughly 7.5 to 9.5 for 6 to 12 weeks, and expect to make like meaningful powerlifting strength gains, not gains that powerlifters would regard as meaningful. So solid gains. But if you wanted to further minimize your training, you could even go as low as performing like a single repetition 1 to 3 times per power lift per week. So we're talking like insanely low, like going to the gym, hitting a single on the squat, a very heavy single though, like at like RP 9 to 9.5, so I near max. And you would still expect to make strength gains, although those strength gains would probably be less meaningful. But adding a couple of back off sets in the form of like triples at like, let's say 80% of the single that you hit, that can make a world of difference. So things from a training volume perspective and strength increases are quite promising, especially for people that may be pressed for time, or even individuals who also want to prioritize hypertrophy training, right? Because this is another way that you could approach this information. But in reality, for 6 to 12 weeks, I'd be very confident now, given the data and all the anecdotal reporting, I guess, post PhD, because this has been out now for a couple of years, if not more. And a lot of people reached out and said, hey, you know what? Actually, I experimented with this. I tried it, and it worked well. I wouldn't say treat this as a training philosophy for the rest of your life, but this is a concept and something that you can play around with whenever you're either super busy, have limited recovery resources available, or even when you just don't care about training as much. Training motivation is low, but you still want to make sure that your 1RM strength is progressing the way you want it to be. It's like a cassette tape.
Now, do you think that varies based on an individual's training level of advancement, whether they're more beginner, intermediate, or advanced? Do you think that individuals who are more intermediate to advanced will benefit from lower volumes because their quality of work is high? They're pretty proficient within a movement pattern.
Potentially. I mean, that's why we did the interviews, right? Because I was like, in the intervention studies, we recruited lifters that were pretty strong, like for literature standards, extremely strong. For you and I, intermediate level. So like we're talking people around 85, 88 kilos who were deadlifting 200 plus kilos, squatting 180 plus kilos, and benching 130 plus kilos. So definitely not somebody you just walk into an average gym and be like, okay, him and him and him. Like we're talking way above the average gym goer. But the reason I did the interviews was because I wanted to get an idea from elite level powerlifters that I could obviously not recruit for my studies. And the lifters that I spoke to, the men had an average total of around 750 kilos.
Yeah.
But the women had an average total of around 462 kilos. And I actually interviewed some women that had and still hold all-time world records on bench press, deadlift, and total. So like we're talking top 5 lifters in the world, regardless of sex, federation, or age, or any sort of category. And those athletes also expressed they expressed that a few heavy sets per week are going to be enough to see meaningful strength increases. For a beginner, I think I wouldn't think that they wouldn't be, like, assuming that beginner has some level of proficiency and they're not like a complete beginner. But like then the counter argument is that because they will be developing that proficiency, even lower volumes of training will be just fine for them to get good at the lift, because they will be shit at the lift, so they'll be just getting better and better. That's not to say, hey, volume is bad. Although the relationship between volume and strength is slightly different than that of volume and hypertrophy, ditto with proximity to failure. But at the same time, as I said, this is not a hey, just train with 3 sets per week for the rest of your life. You could, if you wanted to, but it's likely that you'd hit a plateau at some point. You wouldn't be making hypertrophy gains, and it would be very boring and potentially like ultra monotonous training. You performing a single intervals for the rest of your life, and it could take this with a pinch of salt. Also lead to a few pains and aches, especially if you're hitting like very heavy singles and backoffs all the time.
Mm. Now, is there a specific reason why there's a key difference between strength versus hypertrophy in terms of, well, I mean, the recent position stand from the International Journal of Sports and Conditioning, or the Journal of Sports and Conditioning, they also put out a position stand for recommendations for maximizing hypertrophy, and it was also alluding to a lower volume based approach when it comes to sets per muscle group per week. I believe the range was a minimum effective dose of at least 8 to 12 for stimulating a growth response. But is there a reason why there's a difference between that for strength and that for hypertrophy?
It's a bit of a loaded question because then we would need to look at the mechanisms of hypertrophy, and strength is relatively not relatively is multifactorial. But I would say that it actually I'll take a step back and say I'm not entirely sure because I don't want to give you like a brief answer. I would have to sit down and just really break it down. But it could be that because muscle hypertrophy is actually I'll leave it at that. I don't want to. I'm thinking and I'm like let me not say something that I'll regret saying. But what is clear or clearish, like based on meta-analyses like the one by Ralston is versus the one by Schoenfeld, is that like as far as strength gains go, you could be you're maximizing strength gains at around like maximum 12 sets per lift per week, whereas for hypertrophy you could go 12 to 20, even higher, and see even further gains. But what people fail to realize is that 1 to 4 sets per muscle group per week, as far as hypertrophy goes, can get you the majority of your hypertrophy gains. Majority doesn't mean all, but like you're looking at potentially 60% of potential hypertrophy. And then if you add more sets, you like let's say you add another 5 sets and you're close to 9 sets per week, then you could be looking at like 80 something percent of total hypertrophy. And then those extra sets account for that extra 20% that for you and I, especially for you as a physique competitor, makes sense and it's something you do. But for many people who are after getting jacked and strong, like there will be times where those gains don't matter, you know?
Mm,
That makes
mm.
sense.
Great points, great points. And I think it was around like 2016, 2017. The industry used to be a bit dogmatic about maintaining a higher volume based approach. And it's interesting to see how that's changed over time. You know, I remember working with Jeff Alberts of 3DMJ back in 2015 or 2016. And shout out to Jeff, something big that he always preached was maintaining quality over quantity, because, you know, your quality of work is high. You won't need that much training volume to induce a stimulus for growth. So I think that's great. I think it's some of the work you're doing on the ground is great, and I can't wait to see more come out. And recently there was a systematic review and meta regression, I believe it was, when it comes to training to failure. And I thought it was really interesting to see all the different data points for strength and all the different data points for hypertrophy, and seeing how there's an actual slight difference when it comes to training to failure for hypertrophy. There was an inflection point right about like 1 to 2 RIR, and then for strength, it kind of just maintained the curve. So for strength, could we safely assume that it's a bit more advantageous to stay a little bit further away from failure than it would be for hypertrophy?
Yes, but with some terms and conditions. So first of all, huge shout out. That was by Zach Robinson from Data Driven Strength. Zach Robinson et al., including his business partner and friend, Josh, as well as my sensei, James Steele, among other people on the paper. Insane paper, amazing paper, put us all to shame. And actually, in my opinion, one of the most complete looks at the effect, the relationship between proximity to failure and strength, as well as hypertrophy. Now, the fact that training very close to failure, and as you said, like 0 to 2 RIR, was actually shown to be potentially more meaningful than training like even a few reps away from that, like 3 or 4 RIR. But then strength was shown to be not affected the same way. If anything, going even closer to failure had a potential negative effect. But what the authors as well noted on the paper is that load, so using a heavy weight, is still very important for strength, and that will essentially still require you to have sets that are somewhat close to failure, but because you're using a heavy load, so that immediately puts you close to failure. So doing a single at RP 7 to 8 is different than doing a set of higher repetitions with a lighter load where you're going close to failure. Using a lighter load is not going to have the same effect on strength. And if you're taking that set closer to failure, it may even have a negative effect because you won't have the ability to express the same amount of force as you're fatiguing closer to that set. But the idea here is, and that's, I think the authors have done a good job at avoiding people taking this and going, oh, easy training for strength, hard training for hypertrophy. The idea here is that, if you're going to do that set of 5 at RP10, you could call it a day at RP3 and leave a few reps in the tank. At rep 3 and leave a few reps in the tank versus going all the way to failure, because that's not giving you much from a strength perspective. However, if you're a power lifter or if you're somebody who wants to be proficient at 1RM strength, there is the argument that becoming proficient at the skill of grinding out a rep is going to play somewhat of a role. Now, we haven't explored this in depth in the literature, but you, as a lifter, you're aware that when shit gets hard under a bar, you gotta be somewhat familiar with that feeling to be able to control your bar path, to not give up, and to be able to push through that rep. So that sort of specific practice has a role as well. And if we make the assumption that hypertrophy, at least in the long term, is also important for strength, then you do still have to be close to failure during some of your sets, because if you care about becoming as strong as humanly possible, you will want to gain some muscle as well in the long term, right? Like, this is a relationship that we're still exploring, but I'd say that, your best bet would be to still make sure you are gaining some muscle. So, yeah.
What would you attribute that difference to? So, obviously we want to consider things such as, the force velocity relationship and Henman's size principle, but could those be potential reasons as to why it's more beneficial for hypertrophy, and then you may want to be aware of it a bit more for strength?
Yeah, I think that's what the authors alluded to as well, and the fact that you're able to express more force while you're away from failure, especially with lighter loads. I think that probably is one of the reasons why we see that for strength. At the same time, keep in mind that this, like any other study, had some limitations, so maybe we take things with the pinch of salt. But the literature has been pretty clear as far as heavier weights are better for one repetition maximum strength development than lighter weights. But you may not need to take those very close to failure. From a hypertrophy standpoint, mechanistically, it does make sense based on what you just said as well. That training closer to failure probably allows you to recruit more muscle fibers and blah 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 blah, as they say. And yeah, I'm just being cautious with diving too deeply into potential mechanisms, just because I think that we're opening a can of worms there that we may not be able to close.
Okay, waiting for all the train to fill your warriors to come scream and shout the paper at the top of their head. So that's great. Okay, and when it comes to the benefits and limitations of only interpreting literature and its findings, I think that most people tend to forget that most research only reports averages, and there's always going to be outliers to what's reported, whether it be body composition outcomes, strength, muscle growth. And what would you say are some key takeaways for people to consider when it comes to their own individual response to a certain protocol or certain guideline, and how they could better structure their training to get the most out of it?
Yeah, I think something that you said earlier was really nice. Is that you should be using this as general guidelines, right? Like the evidence at the moment shows, even if we look before this particular meta-analysis and series of meta-regressions, it was pretty clear that for somebody who's interested in maximizing hypertrophy, absolutely maximizing, they need to be training very close to failure, right? So that was clear before that. This didn't just confirm that, but pushed it even slightly further, showing that hey, you need to be training pretty hard and potentially even closer to failure than we previously thought. Now, taking the taking the findings of the study and trying to be exactly at the RIR range suggested is probably fine. But at the same time, if for any reason you are seeing that, hey, I'm actually one rep further away from failure or closer or whatever, and that seems to be working fine. Although I would warrant some caution with interpreting your own experience or your own results, because I'm not sure how clearly you can do that, right? Muscle growth takes time. How are you able to detect whether stopping 3 reps away from failure worked better for you? But if preference plays a role, and if you're seeing a different response that is still very close to the guidelines, that's totally fine. Same goes with volume. So if you're seeing like some people may be able to get away with 20 sets per muscle group per week and they're recovering just fine, and over time they're seeing that they're growing. Others may see that, okay, 8 sets per week, 8 to 10 sets per week, which is still near the optimal range, works really well. They can fit it in because there's a multitude of other variables that we need to consider that play a role in recovery, sleep, stress management, and so on and so forth. So as you said, treat the research as general guidelines, and it's probably not wise to go, oh, I'm going to train with 2 sets per muscle group per week and leave 5 reps in the tank. Like, it's unlikely that, but you going, oh, I'm going to start at 6 sets per muscle group per week and be at like 1 to 3 reps in reserve. That's fine. Yeah, it may not be exactly what came out from the studies, but it's still pretty close, and you're still following the general guidelines. Same with training frequency. We had a meta-analysis in 2016 published showing that training frequency, a greater training frequency is better for hypertrophy. And then we had another one published a few years later by the same author showing that as long as volume is the same, you're fine. And you don't need a greater training frequency. Now, this is to tell you, hey, if a greater training frequency is not something that you prefer, or it doesn't allow you to work more efficiently, it may not be needed. But it may not be needed. It's not like it's definitely not going to have a beneficial effect, or you should do exactly that. Make sense?
That's a great point. So, would you say there are potential limitations of using an RPE and RIR scale for estimating proximity to failure? And given it's more of a subjective scoring, subjective data is still incredibly important. However, I've found from working with people online and seeing them take sets to failure, or even in person, when someone says they have, like, let's say, a 2 RIR, 8 RPE, they still have plenty left in the tank. Now, could we attribute that to them not knowing what true momentary muscular failure looks like, or just underestimating their ability to take a set there?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and another really nice example of how the literature just by itself should be viewed with a level of caution, and where all the terms and conditions always apply. We performed a systematic review. Actually, it wasn't just a systematic review. I'll just tell you the exact title. It was a scoping review and exploratory meta-analysis on accuracy in predicting repetitions to task failure in resistance exercise, led by Dr. Halperin. And that showed that people were imperfect at predicting repetitions in reserve, but like by just one rep. But those was that exploratory meta-analysis was in an acute setting. There were many other variables, but in practice, I've seen exactly the same thing as you. I've noticed that a lot of my clients, like a lot, at least a great deal of them, will send a video where they're like, "Yep, RPE 8," or they will even say failure, and it's like, bro, you had at least 4 more reps there, and the that's where a truly evidence-based approach comes in play, where you don't go, oh, the literature shows that we are pretty good at predicting reps in reserve, and ignoring all the limitations. Therefore, if this guy said RP 8, then I'm going to take this to the bank and assume it's 100% correct. But I think a good way for a lot of people to go about their training, especially if you're unsure of whether you're at a true RP8 or not, or you're training close to failure, is to take sets to failure. And that's what I do in my own training, because I enjoy it and because we grew up as bros. We came in the game as people who had, you had to take every set to beyond failure and do like forced reps. So like for the majority of my training, like things like deadlifts excluded, because I'm training those for strength, I will take sets to the point where I can't physically move or complete even half a repetition, despite attempting to do so while like my life depends on it. So one good way to make sure that you are G-checking yourself, for the lack of a better term, every week is to uh, perform that, though, like maybe your first couple of sets to failure, and just every week see whether your prediction in subsequent sets was so far away from your first set where it doesn't make sense. I received a message while speaking. ADHD kicked in, and it threw me off while talking, but you know what I mean. Like perform sets to failure, and that will definitely give you an idea of whether you're actually good at predicting failure. Because you could do that exercise by yourself. So you could be on a chest support or machine row, and like you're 5 reps deep, and you're like, okay, I think I'm at an RP7, so I have 3 reps left. But then you actually take the set to the house and take it to failure and see if that matches or how close it is to your actual prediction. Because, bro, I've seen people that I've trained with. Close with, even very trained individuals, and like if you push them, they may be able to get 5 more reps out of a set they would have called close to failure.
That's a good point. And I think
Mike Menzer was right. All right.
Tom Platz, that's a great term. I'm going to start using it. G-check yourself. And I think it's incredibly important before you take an exercise close to failure. You make sure you're in a position where you're standardizing your setup and execution. And once you have the green light for that, understand the difference between types of failure. So there's momentary muscular failure when you're actually failing in an exercise related to the target muscle, and that should be the limiting factor in the exercise. Whereas technical failure is where you fail in a movement related to your technique or execution or misgroove during a rep, which that's happened to all of us. But when you're trying to train to failure, gauging the accuracy of that goal is incredibly important. And you could even go try this for yourself. It doesn't have to be a hack squat or a barbell back squat. Do it on a bicep curl. Do it on a tricep extension. Once you think you're at failure, try to give at least 2 to 3 more reps. And if you're not making ugly faces, you're not even trying.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyways, to round off this conversation, Dr. Pack, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your time and schedule with me. Is there anything you would like to leave the audience with as far as a practical application, or maybe any sort of events or papers you have coming up?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say that, hey, your best bet as an evidence-based practitioner is to find efficient ways to keep up to date with the literature. Those that could be through a research review, or like if you're an actually like science interested individual who has some form of academic background and can read papers. There's plenty of evidence-based individuals you can follow and get like an idea of what those latest papers are. But do your best to keep up with the literature. Keep an open mind. Treat science with caution and not as an absolute answer. And at the same time, always remember that your experience counts as well. And it's not experience versus science, but it's rather experience and science to come and make evidence-based babies when okay. enough enough I think that's my cue to leave now and not degrade your podcast anymore.
Oh God, I love it. We're gonna have to link in person soon. That would be a good time of sending some PRs. And I want to thank you again for coming on, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, comment, share, all that good stuff, and hit us with a screenshot of this on your stories. And other than that, we will talk soon, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Bye bye.
Peace.